I'll be reading Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. The author has just got done petitioning the reader to draw near to God, starting in verse 24. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching.
Good morning. It is always a blessing to be an instrument through which God's word is spoken. So it means a lot to be up here. I'm going to start off by telling you a little something about me, okay? I really like movies, specifically old movies, really old movies, some in black and white. And in 1939, one of my favorite films came out, called The Wizard of Oz. It was my favorite movie as a kid. I watched it all the time. And The Wizard of Oz, if for some reason you're unaware, which if you are, there's time to repent, is the story of a strange land where there's a bunch of really cool and exciting things. There's lions and tigers and bears, good and bad, oh my! Good and bad witches, apple trees that throw apples at you, a Wizard of Oz, and one girl whose only focus is to get home. Today we'll be continuing our study in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So go ahead and turn over there. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, focusing on verses 14 and 15. Now, before we get there, let's have some context, because it's been a while since we've seen each other. So 1 Thessalonians is a letter, right, that takes place in Thessalonica. There's a church that's there. Paul and a few others were with him. They got to speak with them for 3 Sabbaths, and then they were ran off. And so this is a letter of a follow-up. And Timothy says, dude, they're doing great. They're doing fine. And so Paul, in his excitement, writes a letter back to them saying, good job, guys. This is a really young church. They've not been in church for long, and not with a long time of instruction either. Over here at Sunset, I'm coming to a close in my time here. I graduate in December. Woo! And as long as 2 years feel, because you don't really sleep, so it's like one long day, right? 2 years still sometimes feels like not enough time. I could not imagine 3 weeks. But that's where we are, right? And so Paul and the guys that were with him get thrown out. So this, as we remember in Thessalonica, is a rather hostile environment, the outside world outside this church. So that's where, this is kind of the setup of what's happening right now. As far as chapter 5, previously in chapter 5, we talk about the day of the Lord. This coming day of the Lord, this feeling of expectation and waiting and the way in which we are to do it. On Friday, last week, Garrett spoke to us in verses 12 and 13, speaking about, you remember, feet on the ground, eyes up to heaven, couch potatoes, you remember that? We're continuing from that thought forward. So read with me in verse 14, starting in verse 14 of chapter 5. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive, encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. So the first thing we'll be looking at is warn the idle. In the film The Wizard of Oz, I'm coming back to it, see? There was a point. In the film The Wizard of Oz, the first person that Dorothy runs into on her journey is the Scarecrow. Well, technically, but you know. On the yellow brick road, the first person she runs into is the Scarecrow. And he's this guy, he's just kind of hanging up there. And his thought process when Dorothy asks him, "What are you doing?" is he says, "Well, I'm just waiting. Don't really know. Maybe something will come along and some great adventure will take me, but for now, I'll just wait." These couch potatoes, as we so lovingly call them, are people who are called idle. In other translations, that is a little bit different. In mine, it says idle, but in others, it says unruly. These are people who are unruly in their behavior. This word idle in the original language is the word, let me not say it wrong. And it disappeared from my notes. But it's a word, doesn't that happen? It disappeared from my notes. But it's a word that deals specifically in the context of your behavior, the way in which you conduct yourself. So these are people who are being idle, which in our connotation might read differently from unruly. But these are people who are unruly in their conduct and in their behavior. And what is it that we just got done talking about in chapter 4? Chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians reminds us the way in which we are to conduct ourselves, specifically with sexual immorality. So what Paul tells us to do here is to warn the idle. So before it was examine yourselves, the way you conduct yourselves, the way that you wait, the way that you are expectant. And he says, now turn to your brother. Look to your brother, your sister. And if you see their behavior unruly for what should be a new Christ-like and Christian behavior, warn them. Warn them. Warn them of the way in which they should be walking, the light that they should be shining. There is a way you should be now that you are in God, yes? And again, remember the kind of world that is right outside the doors of this church. Idolatry, sexuality. You are meant to act differently. Do not be complacent in your conduct, in the progress of your behavior. You should always be striving to be transformed by God, by Christ, in his example. Don't get lazy. As we continue in verse 14, Paul says, encourage the disheartened. The next person that Dorothy gets to run into is a tin man who is without a heart. And then he sings this really catchy song. I won't do it for you now. There's not enough time. But he sings a song of all the things he would do if he had the heart to do it. I would do this. I would sing for birds. I would have a romantic love story. I would go out and do these wonderful things if I just had the heart to do it. Other translations, because mine says disheartened, other translations say timid or faint-hearted. These are the brothers you may know who are worried, who are discouraged, who are fearful, who lack confidence. And perhaps with very good reason. Maybe it's the state of the world that just leaves you discouraged. Maybe it's something that's happened in your life that has left you discouraged, or someone you know discouraged. And Paul calls us to encourage them. I'm so dragged down. And sometimes we're like, man, I don't mind encouraging you, but sometimes when I speak to you, I end up discouraged too. Paul tells us to encourage the disheartened. And encouragement comes in so many ways. Encouragement is speaking, perhaps words of encouragement, reminding them the Lord is coming back. It won't always be this way. We are expectant of him. It can be encouraging words. Sometimes the encouragement of being with someone is as simple as just hearing them out. Just lending a listening ear can encourage someone to know that there is someone who is listening who knows. Sometimes encouragement is as simple as words on a card. Sometimes it's an encouraging letter that says, "Hey, we've been thinking about you. I hope you're okay, but we miss you down here." Paul calls us to encourage the disheartened. Continuing in verse 14, he says, "Help the weak." Simple enough. The next person that Dorothy gets to meet on her adventure down the yellow brick road is a lion, a cowardly lion. And so he's kind of a lion who has lost touch with himself, who has forgotten who he is, and because he doesn't have the heart, can't live up to the full potential of being a lion. And so even though he's built like one, he doesn't act like one. Dorothy calls him the cowardly lion. I call him Matt Gloy, but you know. I love you, brother. That was encouragement in disguise. But I'm glad you're all awake. No, but really, because he has lost the heart of being a lion, he has forgotten he is a lion. He's lost the potential to be a lion. Sometimes we can be like that. One of the things that Paul just got done talking to us about was don't forget the way you are to be. You have to have a heart about you. Now, what is this spirit that he's talking about? Because he's talking about helping the weak. Is it in spirit? Is it physically? Is it morally? In chapter 4, we talk about weakness in moral conduct. So again, the way in which we are to present ourselves, the way in which we are to act now that we are in Christ. To be weak in faith regarding the Lord's return. Perhaps this is a spiritual weakness he's talking about. But if you're weak in your faith, weak in your identity, weak spiritually, it's so easy to forget whose we are and what he does for us. And sometimes you may know those people in your life who, despite having been in the church for how long, maybe they're old as far as their time in the church. Or maybe they've only been it for a short while. We can forget. We can lose heart. And so we are called to help those who are weak. Times of fellowship are so important. One of the things that can make us feel weak is thinking that we're the only one who's going through something. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are other people in this room. I know that sounds funny to point out something so obvious, but sometimes we forget. Your brother or sister is sitting right next to you. We are a family of God. Thessalonica has a church that is all together. Paul has just got done telling them, okay, these are the ways in which you should conduct yourself, the things you should look out for in yourself. Now look out for one another. It's not enough to just have yourself in order. It's great. It's hard getting yourself in order. But don't abandon your brothers along the way. Fellowship and community is something that we are called to do. Unity, relationship, all those things are things that Jesus prayed for. And one of the greatest lies we had ever been told is that we are alone. And whatever you're going through, whatever you're struggling in, whatever your sin, your temptation, you're the only one dealing with it. You're sitting in a crowd of perfect people who are not dealing with that thing. One of the best ways to battle this feeling of being alone and ending up disheartened is to be in the company of your brothers and sisters. So seek fellowship and time with one another. Continuing in verse 14, he says, be patient with everyone. Be patient with everyone. I don't have a Wizard of Oz illustration for this one, so sorry if you were waiting for that. But let's think of the church again for a second. The one in Thessalonica. This is a church with questions. They're anticipating the Lord's coming. This is a church where some are struggling with how they conduct themselves. A church struggling with external opposition from the entire city around them. It feels like that sometimes, right? That the rest of the world just doesn't get it, that they're out to get you. This church is out in the middle of a place that is out to get you, for sure. And so there's a lot of things that could easily discourage them. A church who is very young and has had little instruction. There's a lot of stress here. And even then, sometimes some of us learn faster than others. We know that even in our own classrooms. Some of us get it right off the bat. Okay, great. But some of us need time. And so Paul calls us to be patient with everyone. It may take your brother a while to get out of that funk. It may take your sister a while to fully understand what it is that this text is saying and how it applies in her life. It may take your brother a really long time to really apply this and put it into practice. Especially when we leave this place. Sometimes it's just like, man, why doesn't it click for you? It's written right there. Paul says, be patient. Be patient. We're all at our own pace, but we're all striving to learn. We're all striving to do better. But notice how Paul says, with everyone. He says with everyone, not just with your brothers and sisters, not just with your family, the church. He says, with everyone. You mean out there in that community of people who drove you out, Paul? Yeah. Patient with everyone. So even those who aren't my brother, who are not my neighbor, yeah, everyone. Now I have a Wizard of Oz example. I'm going backwards. This is at the very beginning of the movie. But when Mrs. Gulch tries to take Toto away, she's taking her from Dorothy. Dorothy runs away crying. And Auntie M says to Miss Gulch, for 23 years, I have wanted to tell you everything. Everything that I've thought about you, I've wanted to tell you. But now being a Christian woman, I can't. Mrs. Gulch isn't in her family. There are so many people outside of our family, whether immediate or spiritual, who deserve to still see the love and light of God, even when they attack the people we love. We are now changed. We're different people now. And yes, that changes the way that we see one another as brothers and sisters, but that also changes the way we interact with the world outside us now, no matter how badly they treat us. Continuing in verse 15. Continuing in verse 15. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Again, that everyone else. That for everyone. We don't pay back wrong for wrong. You may hurt me. This sounds like Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount, right? Like you've heard eye for an eye, but I tell you. We are called to do better than what people may do to us. So again, these are Thessalonians. These Thessalonians, they're baby Christians. Outside, an eye for an eye is exactly how the world is. And they must remember who they are now. This may be your former way of life. This may be who you were before you were in Christ, and maybe they may provoke you to be that person again. Don't do it. Don't do it. You're somebody else now. You're somebody else now. So we must strive to do what is good for each other and everyone else. The everything else part is the thing that sticks with you the most, I think, especially when you remember what this church is going through. Because Paul knows. He's not asking this of them as someone who does not understand. He was there. He was ran out by the people in this town. But he still calls them, treat them well. And so looking back at verses 14 and 15, I hope that we can put some of these into our own application. Warn your brother about his conduct. Encourage him when he's disheartened. Help those who are feeling weak. Do good by one another, friend or foe. At the very end of the film, Dorothy wakes up in bed. She's fine. And she's trying to relay to everyone this adventure that she's just had. And she says, even with everything I saw, all I wanted was to get home. We live in a world that is full of distractions, of attractions, of temptations, of all these things that will bring your eyes off the path. She could have found any reason to stay. But all she focused on was the road in front of her and everything that it took to get home. Followed the path. But that wasn't all she did. She brought others with her. Up until this point, Paul has talked about the way in which you conduct yourself, the things in which you should remember. And at this point, in the final instructions, he says, but don't forget your brother. It's great if you can do all these things for yourself, but don't run past your brother on the road. Don't forget him. Garrett had this great illustration. I'm using it again. How he has, that saying, feet on the ground and eyes up. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. A great reminder for the way in which we should be. But I'd like to add, if that's okay, if it's not copyrighted, but also don't forget to look around you also and help those who are also on the path. The lesson is yours.